Good evening, if it is evening where you are. I know that it's morning at where my guest lives very soon. And welcome to End Time. My name is Christopher Maute, and as compared to the news politics specific kind of shows that End Time normally has, I'm going to be doing an interview tonight with the author of a book. Before we get to that, let me just speak about End Time's schedule. Tomorrow there is going to be a discussion with Operator Starsky and Commander McMillan, and they're going to be discussing the current events in Ukraine, and there's going to be a lot to talk about. So please come and check out Nick as he lays down facts with Operator Starsky and Commander McMullen. Okay, with that aside, I'm just going to jump right into it. Ladies, gentlemen, boys, girls, children of all ages, I have with me Richard Firth 𝐓𝐢𝐦𝐿. Wait, that's not quite. Why would I say that? It's actually Richard Firth Godbehere. From a previous interview that he had, he laid out what Godbehere kind of meant, but I'm going to ask him to lay it out a little bit more in a second. And he wrote a book called The Human History of Emotions, not the history of human emotions. And I'm curious about that. But why would I call you? Why would I call your last name 𝐓𝐢𝐸𝐿? What is that? Where does that come from?
Because that's its origins. The old Viking name, there's a Viking name Godbehere, and Godbehere means God's light, and basically that's how they would refer to their priestly class. But the Godbehere bears were the priestly class of the Eorl god. So Godbehere is a more recent version of that name. So I can trace my ancestry supposedly right back to the ancestors. I'm not much taller than they were either, funnily enough, but yeah, so I am a descendant of an Eorl god, which is why when people say, oh, you should just go with the Firth when you're writing books, I go, no, my name's cool, go away.
Oh, yeah. I believe that on Twitter, you were complaining that somebody was complaining about your book just because of your last name.
Oh, yeah, somebody said my last name was arrogant. That was that and some really bizarre misunderstanding of how time works. Were there only two complaints about my book, my surname? It was an arrogant surname. How dare he use that name? Oh, yes. Sorry. You'll have to take it with Olga.
I believe I commented that they were just jealous that God be there.
Yes, probably. Yeah.
So I'm going to begin with the most important question that I could possibly imagine. I don't think anyone's asked this of you yet. How is 𝐍𝐢𝐬𝐸?
She is amazing. She hates winter, so she's a bit grumpy at the moment. She's always a little bit grumpy, but right now she doesn't like to go out because it's wet and it's cold. So she spends time in the house saying, will you stupid monkeys get out of my face? You're just here all the time. But generally, she's fine. She's cool. She's upstairs asleep at the moment.
All right, hold on one second. I'm getting a
bit of that.
Poor network quality and appropriate Wi-Fi, and I might glitch for 1 second. Check 1 2. Check 1 2.
Timing's better.
All right, let's keep it there. So, my apologies, everyone, for the technical difficulties. I do have Nick backstage producing, and he's doing a fantastic job. I'm trying to make his life easy by not having a janky connection. All right, so 𝐍𝐢𝐸𝐻𝐢's doing okay. 𝐍𝐢𝐸 is your cat. You mentioned 𝐍𝐢𝐸𝐻𝐢 in the book. He?
She.
He or she? She, okay.
She's a she.
And yes, and I just wanted to, I am a cat guy. So the fact that 𝐍𝐢𝐸𝐻𝐢 is mentioned so much in the book makes me very happy. So let's go over the super basics. So how did you get into the topic of the history of emotions?
Well, I was a history student doing history. I actually tossed a coin between history and psychology. So while I was doing history, I still had this love of psychology, and I was at Goldsmiths, which is famous for its anomalistic psychology department, where you have people like Professor Chris French, good friend of the great James Randi's, who used to help him with debunking people, teaching. So, of course, I was at all the psychology stuff that he did and stuff as well. But I did a paper. First of all, my wife has something known as emetophobia, which is a phobia of vomit and vomiting. And so I kind of wanted to understand that. And so I was looking into disgust, and I did a undergraduate paper on witches and disgust, and got this ridiculously high mark, sort of, you should publish that, was the comment at the bottom kind of mark. I thought, oh, I'm onto something here. I might have an aptitude for something. So I kind of kept going and just followed it through. And now I am a historian of emotion because of it.
Oh, that's fantastic. So if you studied disgust, I have a few questions for you.
Oh, yeah.
Would you wear Hitler's sweater?
Nope. I don't think I would, even though I know there's nothing to it, even though I know it's just about, it's just, sympathetic magic and all that. I'm still kind of squeamish about this. I can eat anything except a Scandinavian delicacy. Anything else I can pretty much eat.
We're getting there. I got some questions about. So speaking of eating and drinking, would you drink water that I placed a cockroach in for a second and then took out?
Depends where you got the cockroach from.
Oh, which leads to my next question. Would you eat a mealworm?
I do eat mealworms. They are fantastic. They're genuinely, if you've ever had pork scratchings or pork skins, and you've ever had popcorn, if you want a blend of the two, have a bag of mealworms. They're kind of somewhere in the middle, and you can flavor them how you like, with sugar or with salt or with both. They're amazing.
How do you prepare them? How do you get them in a bag?
Yeah, you get them in the bag. There are places that actually farm them for human consumption all over the world, particularly in the East, because they eat them every day as a staple protein. We're just weird in the West. Well, I know they're insects, don't eat them, but we eat prawns, which are basically insects that swim. But we won't eat, we won't eat them if they're on the land. But mealworms are great. Grasshoppers taste just like prawns when you fry them as well. So
I will take your word for it. One thing I noticed in looking at your research on disgust is that you frame it as the opposite of desire. Talk about that a little bit, because that doesn't strike me as intuitive, but when I hear it, I can think of a way that it works.
It is it's more that disgust is a latest version of this idea that some emotions have opposites, and one of them is the best language I can use is that of Hobbes, who talks about desire being the wish to move toward something, and aversion, what we might call disgust, being the desire to move fromward something, to get away from something. And it goes way back to Plato and the Greeks. They had this notion that there was, on one hand, there was this idea of desire, which is you wanting something, you moving toward it, and this idea of aversion, disgust, fastidium, all sorts of different words, that is you wanting to get away from something. Some people, Descartes says, no, they're all the same thing, because all disgust is a desire to get away from something. So it actually is a desire as well. But there's always this kind of desire element to it. But yeah, it's an old idea. And it's not so much that necessarily I believe it's just everybody else has. So,
well, it seems to be like just a reframing of something that is appetitive versus aversive, some kind of dynamic where being pushed away from something or pulled towards something.
Yeah, that dynamic has been a core of thinking about emotions for the past 2,500 years. It's always been there, right? We'll get to it, I'm sure, but like multimodal theories of emotion still have on their axis, one of them is valence. So it's, it's the same thing as Plato talking about, well, there's aversion and there's desire and they're opposites. It's kind of always been there, that they're a move towards pleasure and a move away from pain and all that kind of stuff.
And just for the people listening that aren't familiar with the term valence in emotion research is the same kind of valence in chemistry or electricity, positive or negative. Yeah. Right. So positive emotions versus negative emotions are considered their valence. And there are, controversially, there are neutral emotions. Some would say surprise. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was left out of the Inside Out movie, because how do you, like somebody who represents surprise, I see surprise as neutral. And then the cognitive aspect determines the valence. Yeah. But that's a whole other ball of wax, and we'll get to it a little more. One thing, I hope this works. I'm going to say something, and I want you to explain to me what it means.
Okay, I should try.
Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the topic of abomination. What does that mean?
Oh, I wrote an entire PhD. Well, I didn't, one chapter of a PhD, but it's the bit people like for some reason. Okay. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿 back in the 17th century, bit of the 16th century, were how people would say yuck and ugh and ooh and ew and gross and various things like that. That's kind of an expression of revulsion. You find it in Shakespeare a lot. The famous speech when he picks up the skull and says, says, "Alas, poor Yorick." He says about 5 times, "Fee! Alas, poor Yorick." If you actually read the script, he uses these terms because it's like and they're basically revulsions. So I always say to people, the next time you're reading Jack and the Beanstalk to kids, don't go foo, fi, fo, fum, because that doesn't make any sense. Go fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Which, just as an aside, I said that at a talk in Scotland, and the guy in the front went, "Yeah, the English are disgusting." So that was nice. Thank you, mate.
It's true back then. It's true today, I guess. I mean,
but yeah, but it's our blood. But yeah, so that's what that is. Abomination, interestingly, is I talked about there's lots of different kinds of aversion. The one we like is disgust because it has this very physical sort of pathogen avoidance element to it, of avoiding eating or drinking or smelling or going near things we think can give us disease, which is kind of one of the predominant theories. The late, great Valerie Curtis, she came up with that theory that disgust is the avoidance of things that can give us a pathogen or a parasite, and we evolved that, and if we didn't evolve that, we'd have eaten things and died a long time ago, so it makes sense. But amongst those, there's this thing called abomination, or there was, and you find it's a biblical term, and what you'll find is if you read the Old Testament in Hebrew, like we all do, every day, you will find that the terms that refer to sin that are varied. There are lots of them. There's 𝐓𝐤𝐜𝐿 and 𝐍𝐢𝐜𝐿 and all sorts of different words that mean different kinds of sin. It's like there is, on one hand, you might get. My brain has. I can't remember any sins because I'm such a pious person.
Oh my.
So yeah. So you might get classic disgust of food. You might get that. That's a classic. Or you might get in the Bible, you might get certain smells or certain actions. Idolatry is a different one. Now, when Jerome came along, he looked at all these Hebrew words and went, I've only got one word that fits in Latin, and that's abominatio. So, hey, that's what I'll use for all of them. And suddenly all these very slightly different forms of aversion were wedged into one religious, when God sees you sin, he feels this. It's abomination thing. So abomination is basically the religious disgust God has for sin. And so in the 16th century, it was the religious disgust people had for sin and sinners. It was a particular kind of aversion. So when you saw someone sinning, you would go, fee! That answers the question. The short
I like it. So that your knowledge of that is based on your study of abomination, and your study of abomination is or your study of disgust, I should say, is had a historical bend, the history of emotions. You publish a book. I would like to brag on the book for a moment. Again, the title of it is A Human History of Emotions, with the subtitle, because I have it right here, How the Way We Feel Built the World We Know. Now, for those of you in the audience that are watching this now or are going to watch this, if you have the book or if you're going to purchase the book, which I recommend that you do, I have it both in hard copy and Audible. By the way, Dr. Firth Godbehere does his own audiobook. He does his own voiceover. So this lovely, wonderful voice that you're hearing right now with the English accent, for those of you that are in America that can just listen to this all day, listen to it all day on an audiobook. Now, that said, when you do buy the books, give the good rate. We are in that economy where giving thumbs up, giving good ratings, and all that stuff matters. So if you've purchased the book, please make an awesome rating, because it is awesome. If you purchase the audiobook, do the same thing. So now that I've said that, let us talk about just the history of emotions and how the variables of emotions are framed. So I'm talking specifically about when you're talking about regimes, communities, emotional labor, and emotional scripts. Can you talk a little bit about those things?
Yeah, there's some of the many things that are in the book. Obviously, I won't get into a lot of depth because you can go right into language theory and Austen and that kind of thing if you so desire. But basically, emotional regimes are the ways that you are made, if you like, the ways your culture, your upbringing, your development makes you express your feelings in certain situations. And each person will have different emotional regimes depending on what they're doing. And they're always pretty much always top down. The classic example is you're an air steward or stewardess on a plane, you're in first class, you're at the top of your game, and a very rude customer gets on and starts screaming at you. And you smile and go, I'll be happy to help, sir, because that's the regime. If you did anything else, you'd be out of a job. It's kind of forced on you. Other classic example, and this is the extreme examples of it, are Soviet Russia, where if people, the first person to stop clapping would die, is the famous one when Stalin finished his speeches. So that was kind of a forced emotional expression. But it goes deeper than that, because generally they're much more subtle. They're things we don't even realise we're in this kind of regime. They're just behaviours that we think are normal, clapping at certain things, smiling at certain things, cheering at certain things, knowing that what you should never ever do is sort of smile and wave and do a football chant at a funeral. That's not right. And unless you support the team I do, you shouldn't mourn at a football game either. Generally, I do.
Wait, who's your football team?
Sheffield Wednesday, I'm afraid. We're like the third division down and utterly crap. But, I was born and raised with them, so I've got them. That's that.
I love the tribalism.
It is amazing, isn't it? I was difficult tonight because I have a big affinity with Spain and I watched them lose to Japan, but I like an underdog as well, so it's kind of weird. But
complexity of emotions.
Yes, but yeah, so that's a kind of emotional regime, and a lot of states have them and they impose them, and sometimes it can be quite harsh. Sometimes you don't even know they're happening. It's just your normal day-to-day life. There's a way you behave at work. There's a different way you behave at home and that kind of thing. What was the other ones? Emotional communities. Similar thing, but it's more bottom up. It's about the group, the community you're with. It's how you act with your mates, which would be very different. That person who was on that plane will go to the bar with the other air stewards and stewardesses and will act very differently. They have a different way of expressing and understanding each other's emotions. Much more release, much more open, much more... it's created from the bottom up by a community, a family. Each family will have their own emotional community and know how they're allowed to speak to each other. And often that will grate with other people's families when they run together.
Oh, yes.
Different cultures, again, will have different emotional communities. Barbara Rosenveen, who came up with the idea of emotional community, she spotted it by examining graveyards in the medieval period and looking at what on gravestones, and found that one group had a certain way of referring to their dead and another had a different certain way, and these emotional language that they use differed from different parts of the community, and thought, that's interesting, took it from there. So that's kind of your community, this sort of group within. Emotional labour is, I think, the most misused term in all of this, because I see people quite often, they will say, I had to do all the Christmas cards today. My husband didn't do any either. Oh, that's emotional labour. I'm like, well, kind of.
Well, I thought your stewardess example was a more classic example of emotional labour.
That's a more classic example of emotional labour. That's more classic. Emotional labour is the effort it puts in to behave how your regime tells you to in certain situations, and it's very hard work and it can be very tiring, and that is a great example of it, the air stewardess, and how the air stewardess or steward would have to behave in that situation, put the work in. And it leads to something else known as emotional refuges, which is when they get within their emotional community in the bar and go, there was a passenger today, the idiot, and let it out. Known as an emotional refuge. It's also possibly one of the things that led to the French Revolution and possibly American Revolution and other things that can be quite powerful, an emotional refuge. But that's emotional labour. It's that work you have to do. Classically, it was linked to communism, because the emotional work you would give to your employer would be your excess emotion, if you like. It would be your the emotion you give to them, the emotion you keep for yourself. And I'll not go into that, but it had a very communist origin. which is why saying, "Oh, I did all the Christmas cards," I think is a bit, well, yeah, I guess, but you could have taken off them and handed them to him and said, "Do them, or I'll break your knees." That's what happens. So, so I don't have needs.
The emotional refuge part very much sounds like catharsis.
Yes,
and is that kind of why there was a trend for Marxism and Freudian thinking to be dovetailed together? Like the influences of them are, I mean, I don't know. I might be stretching. I'm not familiar with the link of emotional communities with communism, and since you mentioned it, it kind of got my head spinning.
Well, it's not so much communities; more the labour part is the communist emotional labour, with the surplus emotional labour that you give to the people who impose a regime on you, and so you keep your own emotional labour back for that bar incident to scream and shout and say that passenger was such a complete. And that's kind of how that dynamic works. And like I say, it can lead to revolutions when people get annoyed to go and throw tea in the harbour and things. So, it can break out.
So then, speaking of it leading to wars, I think that for the history of emotions, the way that it makes sense to me is those variables, the regimes, the communities, the labor, the scripts, they change not only over time through history, but in any time in history at different places on Earth.
Yes, yeah. How they work will change depending on the culture and the upbringing and where you are and what's happening and other pressures that are brought to bear. Sometimes they snap back again. So quite often you'll find areas that culturally have quite a strong, stringent emotional regime. There'll be a break against it, like a revolution, as I mentioned, or a war, or something like that. And then when it's all over, you'll get, for example, in France, the terrors. Things will snap back again. Or in Soviet Russia will fall. No small part because people were fed up with being forced to be a certain way. And then 10 years later, that's kind of the regime is, like I say, it's like a comfy pair of slippers. It's nothing you even think about. So eventually, sometimes they come back. So there's lots of things that can influence the emotional regime, and the regime can influence a lot of things. It's a big, complicated juggling of history's like that. It's complicated. Yeah. Anyone says history is simple should go and do something else.
Oh my goodness. I do want to, because we're talking history, written history usually starts with ancient Greece, or at least the written history of, I guess I can say that without being embarrassed. Yeah. So ancient Greece is kind of where things start. And I've read you describe, the way that emotion was thought of in ancient Greece as having reverberations throughout history that to this day we're trying to shake loose.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, their emotional regime had to do with living a good, valuable life.
Yes.
And in doing so, and correct me if I'm wrong on these terms, it was the goal to have pathe. No, it was the goal to have affect instead of pathe, because there are three variables: your body, your material substance, your ability to perceive, or your thoughts, and then your feeling state. And if your feeling state drove the other two, that was pathe and bad.
Yeah.
Whereas if thoughts drove your emotions and bodily states, that was affect and good.
Yes.
Could you talk more about that?
Yes. It's known as the tripartite soul. And every Christian on earth understands it without knowing it. Basically, the idea is that there are three parts of the soul, and this varies between Aristotelians and Platonists, but they both came from the same place, so it's the same, really. Part of your body is they will call it the vegetative soul. That's the stuff that's alive, and plants have that. It's just this stuff. Then you have the sensitive soul, which is the bit that feels and reacts and senses, and that animals have it as well, and they can feel and react. And then you have the lots of words for it, the logos, which is the mind, the thought, the thinking part of your brain. And humans are the only things on earth that have all three. We have all three together. Now, The sensitive part can be perturbed by events, can cause perturbations. That's basically what a pathe is. It's a perturbation of the sensitive soul, which can affect the logos, the mind, the thinking part.
I am just now making the connection between pathe and pathetic.
Yes.
Just like literally 1 second ago, I was like, wait a minute.
Wait a minute, yes.
Keep going.
Yes, the Greeks were pathetic. Yeah. So, yeah, that can lead to bad things because you feel and then you react instantly. But on the other hand, you can evaluate things, you can think about things, and you can still have a feeling, but it's righteous, it's correct, it's the right kind of anger, for example. You can have righteous anger. You should have righteous anger if there's something you've thought about that's wrong, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, there's this two-way movement, and that went on for a long time. That belief of the three-part soul basically went right up to Descartes. He's the guy who went, oh, it's two. And everyone, oh, that's much simpler. We'll go with that. But the three-part soul is, if you ever wonder, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that's kind of what it's referring to, that God himself has a Father, a wise part, a Son, a fleshy part, and a Spirit, a spirited part to him. That's even God is this tripartite thing. He's just better at it, supposedly, than we are at things. So that's why I say
Descartes talked about passions.
Oh yeah, Descartes wrote a whole book about passions.
That's what I thought. I was like, Descartes is like, and passions is the same thing. So he broke it down to two, right? Like but he broke it down to him. Passions were something that happened in your body. And that you had to be very careful with them. But Descartes' a very complicated person. He's also pretty much the first person who talked about emotions, but to him they were a motion outwards, an emotion that happened when you had a passion. So it was more the physical expression of the emoting process.
Came from the heart out of the body because everything moves, and then the body moves, and that was what an emotion was to him. But passions was the feeling bit. I'm getting sidetracked. But yes. So yeah, that's the Greeks in a nutshell, and it affected Christianity and it affected thought for a long time. A lot of medicine, humoral theory entirely based itself upon this idea that there were three parts to the soul and you could treat different bits in different ways. It had a huge impact for a long time, like a lot of Greek thought did, especially again through Aristotle.
in the influence of Greek thought, in parallel, in the East, they were talking about emotions as desires.
Yes.
Yeah. And so how is that different?
It's kind of isn't. The only difference is that the great Indian, basically, religions, the great South Asian religions, Buddhism and the various forms of Hinduism, they both focus on desire, being drawn towards things, as being absolutely central to their faith. In the case of Hinduism, there are lots of different kinds of desire, and can be desire for wealth, or there can be desire for health, or there can be desire for fame, all these things. But the most important you'll heard of is dharma, and that is desire to follow your true path. You must follow your true path. In the Bhagavad Gita, there's I can't remember his name right now, but the character is told by Krishna himself, I know you're about to go to war with your own family, but that is your path. So however painful it is, that's what you must do. So that's kind of the Dharma, following this path. The difference in Buddhism is that the only desire you should have is what is known as now as a second order desire, the desire to not desire. Second order desire is the desire to desire something. Which
rhymes with the Stoic kind of Greek, like it rhymes, like in parallel rhymes with the kind of ideas that the Stoics and the Greek were saying, which is the true happiness is to desire without desiring. They didn't use those words in particular, but that's what they were getting at. Yes,
to follow your true self. It's very similar. Stoicism is all about following your true self and appraising everything and thinking, should I make this decision based upon how I'm feeling? Will it benefit me and the people around me? And then deciding whether to go with it or not. That's kind of the core of Stoicism. And if you can do that, you can have genuine virtue. That's genuine virtue within yourself.
Well, that just sounds like cognitive behavior therapy.
That's because it is cognitive behavior therapy.
Oh, interesting.
Just with more sandals.
I was expecting that.
Yeah,
that was good.
CBT, there are a lot of things that keep coming back, and we like to give them scientific names. My favorite at the moment is emotional intelligence, which is been around for 2,000 years as well. You know, it used to be called manners.
Knowing how to read a room, right?
But I mean, seriously, there were in the 17th century books on manners as a science, that this is how you must behave, and this is how you'll get better in life, and this is how you'll do things if you behave in certain ways, and this is etiquette, and this is how to make your business better and your life better, which is just emotional intelligence. Basically, that's EQ is all about. It's this same sort of thing. So these things do get scientized from time to time and come back.
And just to bring it all together, cognitive behavioral therapy is taking on very mindful practices that are a combination of Stoicism and Buddhism, which are already kind of in parallel. Like it seems like it's coming full circle.
Yes, it does. There's some people, I don't necessarily think so. Some people actually think there was a massive influence on Greek thought and Stoicism when Alexander got to India and they met the gymnasts who we think were Buddhists. And some of this thought came back into India. It's a very small time frame, though. Basically, it's about 327 BCE that Alexander was in India, and it's 301 BCE that Zeno started his school of Stoicism. So there's enough time, but kind of not. It's kind of close.
It kind of sounds like Jungian, like collective unconscious thing. Like, there are these tales, like the Joseph Campbell way of looking at things, the hero's tale, where like humans just spontaneously all over the world come up with very similar sounding stories.
Yes.
But I mean, the more that's looked into, the more the major beliefs that we study might have been seeded, like you were talking about. Like there's potential.
There's no evidence for certain. We think that the Greeks met some Buddhists, and we know that 20, 30 years later, they had a very similar new version of Platonism called Stoicism. So it's maybe, who knows? But that's that.
All right. So now I'm gonna transition into the second third of tonight's interview. And for those of you that are watching, if you want to do some super chats and ask some questions, we'll be addressing that in the very last part of tonight's interview. So please feel free to, and even if you don't super chat them, just ask questions. Nick is archiving them and sending me things in Discord DM to access later. So we talked about cognitive behavioral therapy a moment ago.
Yep.
And cognitive behavioral therapy, you also mentioned wars a moment ago. So I'm going to bring the two of them together. And I'd like to focus on one specific chapter of your book that talks about shell shock. And shell shock as it applies to veterans coming home from World War I. And then, of course, that being a boom in clinical psychology. World War II in America was literally the beginning of clinical psychology. The government was giving grants to universities to start clinical psychology programs because psychiatry, which was who people saw at the time, was a medical degree that just took too long. Yeah. So universities all over the United States popped up with 4-year graduate programs and PhDs in clinical psychology. Yeah. That's World War II. Shell shock as a diagnosis came to popularity in World War I. The question I want to ask is, how many women were diagnosed with shell shock during World War I?
Somewhere between none and absolute zero.
Okay. So it's not a non-zero number?
It's no,
not a non. So carry the one. Okay.
Yeah, it was a man's disease. Hysteria was the women's disease, and hysteria had been around for, again, millennia, since the Greeks. The Greeks believed it was caused by the hysteris, the womb, wandering about the body. That's what happens when you don't actually open up any human cadavers to look inside them. You start to think things like that.
Just guess.
Just guess. Look at pigs. That's good enough. Yeah.
Wait, because pigs had floating uteri? What's plural for uterus? Uteruses.
Uteruses. I'm a doctor, me. Yeah. No, they didn't. But I don't know. They wanted an explanation. But hysteria, it is the same thing as hysteria, basically. It is.
So you're telling me that shell shock is the same as hysteria?
Sort of, yes. It is symptomatically kind of similar in that it is. It has the same sort of lack of control. It has the same sort of inability to cope with things. It has a sudden onset, usually caused by some great trauma. It has all the hallmarks except for the massive war. And indeed, nurses in the First World War on the front lines would come back with exactly the same thing as shell shock because they were there and be diagnosed with hysteria because they're not men, so it couldn't really be shell shock.
Oh, well, but hold on a second. Why weren't the soldiers just diagnosed with hysteria?
Because hysteria was a women's disease, and they thought at the time.
I wanted you to say it, not me.
Yeah, I know. Yes, misogyny, people. It's not new. So in fact, it gets worse the further back you go, and then gets better, and then gets worse again. So that's misogyny for you. But basically, the idea was that women could have hysteria whenever. It was part of a woman's character. They were more emotional. Of course they are. Not. And so a woman could just develop hysteria. Off the cuff, she could become hysterical. We have seen the old films where the cure for this hysteria is either fainting or a good hard slap. Neither of which are medical ways of doing things now, thankfully.
Yes.
But
Thank you, Sean Connery.
Yes, Sean. Yeah, it's that was the kind of hysteria. That's what I'm talking about. That kind of in the old black and white films where women would just suddenly go nuts because something was happening, and that's not real. That doesn't happen. But that's what they thought. But they thought if men reacted like that, there had to be a trigger. Mm-hmm. They firstly had to be something in the man himself, and there had to be some kind of trigger. It could be. It first started appearing with people who got something known as railway spine, which were the people who worked on the railways who hurt themselves really badly or saw somebody get killed in front of them during the railway, and they would freak out. It was just like, I can't do this, and they called it railway spine. But because they're men, there was a trigger involved. Women, they could always do it. Men, it had to be triggered because men are manly men because they're men. You see. And particularly during the Industrial Revolution.
I love that.
I know. This during the Industrial Revolution in particular, there's this idea of the very strong, manly man. Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, "One day you'll be a man, my son," is all about that manly man who is a man. And this is when you're a man, you're a manly man.
Well, hold on, let's. I want to double click on that. So this idea of masculinity,
yes,
that existed in Victorian England, that was left over towards the beginning of the 20th century, when 1914 World War I begins. All that, the idea of masculinity in the Victorian era, it described to me how sentiment and will, as feeling states, distinguished where you were on an evolutionary chain of being. How did that help?
It's the idea is, this is complicated. This is I'm having to remember my book now. I wrote it a while ago.
I'll talk. I know all about it.
No, you read it more than me probably. I read it to a microphone, very slowly. Yeah. No, basically there was this idea that we're different. That will and volition is the sort of the greatest thing that we have that makes us different from the animals, and is a very manly thing that you can control, and that you become manly because of it. And this was in a lot of the medical textbooks at the time of the First World War, and even then a lot of this science was out of date. I will say that caveat. There are other people like Charcot and the very young Freud hanging about going, now what on earth are you talking about? But a guy called Robert Cole, in his textbook Mental Disorders, I can remember some of it, he talked about how there were different areas of emotions, and that you had at the very, very bottom, this idea of affection is the sort of the lowest on this chain of being. And of course, at the top is volition, the idea of thinking and deciding something. I mean, low volition, you've got intellect, which is just kind of thinking without the deciding bit, if you like. And then you've got feelings at the bottom. And then underneath that, those affections, feelings, that itself is then broken down into affections, which are just what we talked about earlier, being drawn to that which gives us pleasure and going away from that which gives us pain. That's what it is. We're born with that. That's very normal. Babies do that. Cockroaches do that. Whether or not they've been in my drink, they do all this kind of thing. And then above that, you get emotions, which are kind of more... actually, I've got the quote right here. Cole called them that they were... Where is it? No, I haven't got the quote yet. But he called basically emotions were those feelings you feel and you understand them, and they're a bit more complicated than just pleasure and pain. They're your happiness, sadness, desire, disgust, all that kind of thing. And they can be perverted, and they can make that's where insanity can start, when these things have gone wrong. And then above that you have basically what's the last one? Why is my brain just gone? My brain's just gone for the top one. I know this. I wrote about it. I did the research.
Well, volition is at the top, and then
volition.
Then it's sentiments. Then emotions.
Sentiments are the top of the affections.
Okay.
Right. So at the top of your affections, so you've got at the bottom you have basic affections. Above that you have emotions. At the top you have sentiments. Now sentiments, this is an old idea, and back in the 18th century sentiments was divided into the moral sentiments, which was the idea that when somebody does something morally good, you feel that it is morally good, and when they do something morally bad, you feel that it is morally bad. And this was often linked to art. So you see something that is beautiful and you feel that it is beautiful. You see something that is ugly, you feel that it is ugly. And that's actually how, funny enough, side, how the word disgust got dragged into English as a commonly used word, because they wanted a word for the opposite of beautiful. And they thought that word about things that taste bad, because it's all about taste. It was all taste theory.
Oh, okay.
That's disgust. And so disgusting art, bad art was disgusting. And you can learn to refine your sentiments. But they also, in the Second World War, believed there was another...
Hold on.
Yeah.
So non-aesthetically pleasing art wouldn't be called disgusting if there wasn't a movement where appreciating art, aesthetics, was known as taste.
No, there was something called taste theory. It came before aesthetics. It became before the Germans started the aesthetic school.
Okay.
The British had the taste school, the taste theory. And the taste theory, they were searching for a word for the opposite of beautiful. And they didn't really have one. They tried ugly. Well, it's not quite, because sometimes a very ugly thing can be still quite stunning. It can still quite make you feel something. So it's not quite right. They wanted something that conveyed that factor. That factor when you have too much of something and it's revolting, or that when it's just so bad you can't look at it. And they thought, there's this word, it's very rarely used, but it means things that taste incredibly bad, so bad you can't swallow them, you can't go near them. Let's use that, because that's the opposite of beautiful. So that's where disgust came into the English language and became very common. Next thing you know, it's in Johnson's dictionary with something like 130 different definitions, whereas the dictionary before, it was one. It was just disgust, distaste, and that was it. So then it's suddenly blown up.
Different.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's the sentiments. But there's a third sentiment at the time of the Second World War known as the intellectual sentiment. And that is how you feel when you know you're right, or how you feel when you know you're wrong, which we might nowadays think is kind of a dangerous sentiment, because a lot of people who feel when they're right are wrong. Yeah, confidence. And there are lots of confident idiots in the world, as we all know.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Victorian era vision of manliness,
right?
Masculinity. The way that the wonderful way that you describe it in the book, and the analogy that comes into my head, the visual I get, is on the evolutionary chain that they kind of hijacked for this moral purpose. Having a mental illness in Victoria was like sliding down the evolutionary scale, because if at the top you were thoughtful and moral and you had sentiment and all those things available, those weren't available to you, to creatures, organisms lower down on the evolutionary scale.
Yep.
Does that sound about right?
Yes, and they believed that as you grew, as you got older, to them, the peak of humanity, the peak of evolution, was the civilized Western man. That was where you
How convenient.
Yes, how convenient that supposedly civilized white Western men think that supposedly civilized white Western men are the peak of... Anyway, that's what they believed. And so, as you got older, you moved towards this civilized person. You became more evolved, and you got better at having your sentiments prior to your emotions, prior to your affections. And you got better at having volition and making wise choices on all of these things as you got older. And so if you had a mental illness, you would draw down back through that, which effectively means you got younger. You became young. You became childlike. Now, just to add a huge extra pinch of terrible misogyny, women never, they thought, got beyond the child stage. Right?
Yeah.
Nice, huh? So, yeah. So that's kind of...
It's to listen to.
Yeah, psychology's come a long way. So don't judge it by the likes of Charcot and...
Well, hold on a second. Freud. So here's where, because we're on In Time and this is about politics and current events, this version of masculinity doesn't sound foreign.
No.
I mean, let me rephrase this. It sounds foreign in the sense that, like, viewing women, hearing the technical way that they were misogynistic is surprising. But this idea that men are to be this strong, you know, like the father that Freud grew up with, you know what I mean? The Germanic father that had, you know, post-industrial revolution where their labor was their sense of pride and they were earning blah, 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 blah. That hasn't gone away. There are facts. Tucker Carlson is goddamn making documentaries about the reduction in masculinity in our culture. I mean,
oh no, yeah.
These ideas aren't foreign, and I think that in today's so let's bring the history up to date. There is like a whole bro culture that is a cottage industry of that idea. That Victorian idea of masculinity is now relabeled as hustle culture, bro culture, whatever. It's this idea that if you want to be a man, you need to be smoking a cigar on a couch with a button-down shirt unbuttoned, talking about how rich you are and how much, you know, you crush whatever. Yeah. And it's like this weird... And of course, in America, we can look to Trump as having given license to that kind of thing, but it was here before then. But now it just seems cartoonish. It's almost like I would love to think that they were all Andy Kaufmans making fun of how extreme a position they have. Yeah,
I have noticed that. You think, it's pose law, isn't it? Is this parody or is this not? Yeah, it's interesting. It's also, I mean, there's one thing that's I didn't mention it, but that's interesting about Victorian masculinity or early 20th century masculinity is that there was a change because soldiers would walk down Hyde Park arm in arm. And there was a thing where men who loved each other passionately would kiss on the lips and things. So that goes right back to the knights, the Burleigh knights. And then Oscar Wilde happened. He's literally overnight. He was sent away for being homosexual, and men stopped acting like that. Literally overnight, if you look at the record, because men didn't want to have the same thing happen to them. Because Oscar Wilde was like a 6'4", strapping, very butch bloke. Nobody thought that he was gay. Not that it matters. The man was a genius, but back then it was like, oh no, if he can go down, what can happen to me? You know. So that's an interesting thing. Bro culture have lots of hugging and things. They're not quite got to kissing on the lips when they're happy, but I think they're that far away. Curiously, weird aspects of masculinity that some things can be seen as masculine that weren't.
Yes.
Well, you know.
Yeah, well, to your point, like the Tucker Carlson documentary that I'm talking about, and I haven't seen the whole thing. Thank goodness, I'm not that masochistic, but I've seen people review it, and it begins with like wrestlers, not like WWE and not like sport wrestling where they're in the unitards. Yeah. Just two dudes in shorts, no shirt, no shoes, just wrestling in a gym. And that's the B-roll. and it's just like, man, are you not getting how homophobic this looks?
Yeah.
And also the idea that men complaining that masculinity keeps declining just seem obsessed about men. And do they not see the irony about that?
I know is very ironic. I also find this whole focus on masculinity, which is a very fluid concept anyway. It's changed over time.
Oh, yes.
So much over time. I mean, it used to be very masculine to have a pederastic relationship with a young boy in the Greek eras. Well, by young boy, I mean sort of 50s, 60s, 70s. Still younger than we would think is fine now. Yeah. But that was the height of masculinity because you were the active giver and they were the passive receiver. I'll not go beyond that, but you can use your imagination. That's kind of was seen as a thing that happened, and that was very masculine. Two adult males, no, you didn't do that because there was a confusion as to who's active and who's passive. But in that group, that form of masculinity, that was masculinity, and it changes all the time. So what they're calling is there's no masculinity now. What they mean is they're very narrow, tiny little version of masculinity that comes from watching too much John Wayne. Is basically, that's masculinity. It's the big butch man who's tough.
We're both old enough to have lived through being musicians. Yeah. A very clear arc where men were feminized, and then that kind of ended.
Yeah,
and I'd say it started with Led Zepp, right? With not the overt not like the New York Dolls kind of stuff, but like Robert Plant looked feminine. And by looking feminine with the long blonde hair, he was the most manly dude. When he was on stage, pardon my language, I'm going to curse, but he was swinging like God's own dick. He just was exuding testosterone in a way that today he just kind of looks like an effeminate man. Yeah. And then we went through the hair metal phase where the more makeup you wore, the tougher you looked? Question mark. And I'm a huge Prince fan. Does anyone remember Purple Rain? Yeah. They were the most effeminate looking pimps and were crushing.
Yeah.
So, I mean.
Yeah, the 80s were interesting because the louder your music, the more feminine you looked. It was just sort of. That was the way it was, it was metal music, and being a man meant wearing a lot of makeup, having beautiful long blonde hair. And it kind of, the last great champions of that were perhaps Guns N' Roses, and then grunge came along and they all went, suddenly it was all about.
Long hair stayed until it didn't.
The long hair stayed, yeah.
And then you saw Metallica getting a haircut and Soundgarden getting a haircut. And
it's interesting because, Kirk Hammett was quite a pretty young man in the early days. Mm-hmm. Long hair, they say, Metallica wore makeup when they made the Loaded album. Well, I'm newsflash for you. He wore makeup during Ride the Lightning as well. So let's get this right.
It's not get crazy.
Yeah. But it changes over time. And I wonder, it's kind of, I think what they're looking to is what I would call their dad's masculinity. That sort of, if you weren't the hearkening to the 50s masculine man, this legendary dad masculine person. I was reminded the other day of my late dad once shouted at my brother because he made a ham and cheese sandwich because you don't mix fillings. Real men have a ham sandwich or they have a cheese sandwich, right? Mixing fillings. We think it's actually because he came from quite a humble background with not much money, and that was frivolous to use two things. That was a waste. Make one or make the other. Don't waste it. That's two meals there, and you've made them one. What are you doing? That's expensive. But there's a kind of a masculine element to that sort of. Men don't do that. Men don't. At least you let men make sandwiches, right? There is that. But they have.
That's what I thought you were going to go with.
No.
I thought that you were going to be like, he's like, what are you making a sandwich for? That's not.
No, he's fine with making a sandwich. It just had to be either cheese or ham. But, but that's kind of, I think that kind of man that my dad was kind of manly, blokey man, is who they're thinking of when they think of this masculinity. And gender is kind of, I'm interested in it and getting more interested because it is kind of a cognitive emotional construct that we have. It's based very much on a feeling whether you want to call that feeling an emotion, but feeling your gender is what it's all about, right? I feel like I want to present in this way or present in that way. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, when you see these people, you do want to say, I think he doth protest too much when you see them on the couch with the button down. And I spent 8 hours in the gym. It's like, did you? Okay.
That sounds horrible. Exactly. Yeah. Or, well, another thing, the it sounds horrible. That's my new way of approaching all of the hustle culture stuff. Like, oh man, if you really want to make it, you got to start. You got 5 part-time jobs in the gig economy. But I'm like, I was a musician. I knew what the gig economy was before it was called that, and I am embarrassed at you guys saying that that is something we should aspire towards. Like, you're killing me. Like, few people are full-time musicians for a reason. It is difficult to juggle that life. Yeah. And to be like, oh man, we each need to hustle and hustle. And it's like, you know what? You're a dick. If all you're going to do is say that you need to go, you're going to give into the grind. And they don't talk about that. They don't talk about giving into the grind, because men are supposed to be invulnerable until something happens, which brings me back to shell shock. Yeah. Yes. Women can have hysteria because they're women, right? Men can only have shell shock if something happens. Exactly. Yep. Exactly that. So I want to take that as a way to kind of move the conversation towards current theories of emotion, because that stimulus response style of thinking about emotions, right? Like something happens and we react to it. That reaction is the emotion. Is still taught today, but it's getting varied. It's now taught today as the classical model, of course, meaning that there are new models of thinking about it. Yeah. Now, we have about a half hour, and I do want to remind people who are watching that if you have questions, put them in chat. And if you want to super chat them, that would be great too. And we'll get to them towards the end. So we have about a half hour, and I do want to talk about, I want to get to those questions. I want to talk about the future of emotions, but I do want to kind of situate how the history of emotions helps support more modern and current and recent theories of emotion that buck this classical way of looking at things, where there is a stimulus that you respond to. Now, before we do, let's you and I quick do a history of emotions research, specifically when emotion was taken as a scientific subject of study. So if we can start with Darwin. Yeah. Right. That would be a fair place to start. Like his book, The Expression of Emotions in Humans and Animals. Yeah. In Man and Animals. Man and Animals. Of his time. But he meant humans. That's what it meant then. But yes, Expression of Emotion, Man and Animals. I'm a big fan. I seem to have this thing for people's last books. So I really like, and people seem to write about emotions last as well. So I really like Descartes' last book about the passions, the use of the passions. I really like Darwin's last book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. And basically, just 60 years prior to this, in 1900 on the dot, a guy called Thomas Brown cracked an old question, which is, how do we separate feelings and thinking? Newsflash, we don't, but we'll get there. People have been wanting to do this forever. And he came up with this idea that these emotions that Descartes was talking about, well, that's it. These are things that go in and you feel them. You don't have to think about them. The same way you see something and you just see it. You don't see an apple and go, that is an apple, and then realize it's an apple. It's just an apple. And so he wrote The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. Now, this is an interesting book because someone I'm sure we're going to talk about in a moment, Paul Ekman, who is about all emotions, or there being a set of very basic emotions that have evolved that all humans feel, once wrote a foreword to Darwin
to say how Darwin inspired him. But also, Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist who believes that emotions are all cultural and there's nothing universal about them, once wrote a foreword to Darwin to say how he inspired her. And the reason for that is in the book, there's lots of pictures of faces and various other things saying, this is that emotion, this looks like that emotion, this is that emotion, that's what the expression is. And then there are anecdotes from all over the world saying, we've seen this different kind of feeling here, we've seen this unusual feeling there, and this different feeling there. So it doesn't matter whether you're an anthropologist who thinks they're cultural or you're a universalist who thinks they're all evolved, you take from Darwin what you want.
Well, it's funny you mention that because starting with Darwin as the godfather, if you will, or grandfather of emotional research in science, everybody after him has claimed to have an evolutionary theory, right? When James Lang talks about his theory, he thinks that it's there because of evolution. When Magda Arnold is laying out appraisal theory, she thinks it's evolutionary, right? When Ekman thought that he was, directly through Sylvan Tompkins and with Carol Izard, the direct lineage of Darwin's research. But I kind of want to, without going into the details of that, because this isn't a history of emotions course, but the idea of stimulus first, then response, that is pervasive through all of the models, right? James just had a different theory. So when you see a bear, for James, the James Lange theory, or Lang, however you want to pronounce it, he thought that the bodily reaction happened first, and then our awareness of that bodily reaction was the emotion, our perception of the body, but the bodily thing happened first. And then as a reaction to that, cognitivists or appraisalists were like, well, if we're going to talk about order, we think we have good enough evidence to say, using information theory, that the cognitions happen first, and downstream the bodily things happen and the cognitive or the emotional things happen, right? And everybody except James was trying to shoot for a universality of emotions in humans, right? And only when James was misinterpreted was he labeled as somebody who thought that a specific body state went with a specific emotion, but that's not really what he said. And that's outlined by Lisa Feldman Barrett, who I need to mention because she is the person in modern day emotions who your historical approach dovetails with so nicely. She has a psychological construction theory of emotion that is much more like James, in that she believes that through interoception, which is our appraisal of bodily events, we are perpetually appraising what's happening in our body. And because of the version of perception that she believes in, it has to do with our brain being a body budget machine. And the most efficient way that it works is to make predictions about what's going to happen. And that happens in such a way that we live in the simulation that our brain predicts, only touching reality when our predictions are incorrect. Now, that means that the stimulus that we respond to sometimes is a simulation that we've created. But it also means that sometimes we respond to the thing that deviates from our expectation and genuinely is a stimulus that bottom up is causing the emotion. Whereas for her, everything else is top down. It's all very, it's not a social construction of theory. It's not a social construction theory. It's a psychological construction theory. This fits your model, right? Your idea, or let me say, this model fits your research, I should say that, because it allows for these different ways of expressing emotions, having emotions, the lack of universality, the fact that the same face can mean a bunch of different emotions, that the same emotion can have a bunch of different expressions, right? It allows for that flexibility. When you stop looking for universals, then you can appreciate what is at core, right, that we really evolved with, and how our circumstances change how we talk about it. So I've talked a little too much about that, but please kind of riff on that a little bit.
Yes, that was a very good explanation of her thought. One of the reasons she talks about William James is because he was a psychological constructionist, and that's the thing a lot of people make. He didn't believe. Basically, there are two schools of thought within a lot of psychology. There's the idea that there is faculties. We've all heard that. there's a circuit for this, there's a circuit for that, there's a bit of the brain for this, there's a bit of the brain for that. And there's the idea of the constructionists, and they are actually, no, when you really look at it, all the brain works all the time at almost everything. So when you say a word, you don't just have the bit about speaking lighting up, your Broca's area and your vernix area and all that kind of stuff. What happens is you remember what the word is, you remember the last time you use it, you know what context is, you know how to say it, you know who you're saying it to, you know why you're using that word, and so lots of the brain works at once. And that's kind of James's thing, that lots of the brain works at once. You can't just say there's a circuit, because if there was just a vernix area for a circuit, we wouldn't be able to really speak, because we wouldn't know how to speak in context. We certainly wouldn't know not to swear near our grandmothers, for example, because you need the rest of the brain for that. You need to remember the last time you did and what happened. You know, so
looking for the parts, and just as for didactic reasons. The thing that you're talking about, I usually refer to as functionalism. I don't refer to it. Others have. I teach it this way because other smarter people have done this for me. But the reason why it's called functionalism is because think of like stream of consciousness, right? The idea that we are a large structure that can be broken down like a table into more basic parts. That was like the Wilhelm Wundt school, the Titchener school, the structuralist school. And that would allow for like a modular kind of theory of the brain, like you were talking about. Like this area does this, circuit does this thing. Whereas James was like, well, yeah, we might have those circuits, but how it reacts is completely different on the context. Yeah. And also the output is going to be perceived as something different depending on the context. Yeah.
So that's that difference is kind of core to the psychological construction theory of emotion, because again, you will have your faculties, your functionalists, who will break down the brain, and they will say, we've found that the amygdala is the section of the brain for fear. And then people go, but there's this woman who didn't have an amygdala and she could still get terrified of certain things. So explain that. And they'll go, the brain's plastic. And then
plasticity.
Plasticity, that's it. The brain created a pseudo amygdala or something. And it turns out all the rest of the brain. Interestingly, this particular woman, she got frightened about different things than she used to, but the brain still was still trying to effectively protect her. And the way I see it is, being frightened of things is one of our great defense mechanisms. It stops us from dying. So, of course, the brain's going to have a backup and a secondary backup and a third backup and different ways of putting it all together. And it's going to use the whole brain to do that. Yeah. So that's kind of very important. But it also, she doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. She doesn't do what some people do and say, yes, there is no universality. That means there's no evolution. Emotions are just a constructed thing that comes from culture. She says, no. At the core of it, and she does this with James Russell as well, who's a colleague of hers who's fantastic, James. And he comes up with the idea of core affect. And these are these very basic sets of feelings that we have that are what we evolved. And then we label them and understand them and place them in context and try to understand. And different cultures will have different labels for different or similar things. And it will shift. Like I say, the difference between abomination and disgust, as I explained earlier, they come from the same core affect, from the phi core affect, but they are slightly different in what they mean and how we understand them and how we behave around them and all that kind of stuff. I actually think disgust is a great way of explaining Barrett, actually, because it does have all these flavors, which is ironic for disgust, but there you go.
Okay. Well, there can't just be one disgust.
No. And that seems to be becoming a more prevalent idea within those of us who look at emotions, because wherever we look, when you look at history, that's what you see. You see this different version of 𝐓𝐤𝐽. You see a different understanding of happiness. You see love described as a pull towards something, which sounds like desire, but actually it's not. You know, Aristotle believed that the reason we stick to the earth is because we love it. You know, we're pulled towards it. That's the same kind of attraction. So these things are different, and these things are subtle. And you look in history and you look at how, and this is one thing that's always blown my mind, one of the great early writings in the history of emotions was a paper on the Crusades called "Crusading Was an Act of Love." And you let's say that and go, what? But it's not saying it was a good thing. What it's saying is that the Crusaders believed they were doing this for Christ, that they were taking the Holy Land. Yeah. But yeah, they thought that's what they were doing. They thought they were taking the Holy Land for Jesus, for Christ, and they loved the Holy Land. There are even
they'd have to be monsters otherwise.
But there are Arabic writings saying it's incredible how much these weird white people love this place. They don't even live here. You know, it's like this kind of stuff. To be remembered with the Crusades, that only the first Crusade was really successful, and that's because the Muslim groups were all fighting each other. The rest of the time, the Crusaders got their asses handed to them pretty much every time. But it's
wait a second. If the first Crusade was successful, why would there need to be more?
Exactly, because they kept getting kicked out and having to go back again and making mistakes. And in the case of my favourite, the Fourth Crusade, where the Catholic Church completely excommunicated all of the Crusaders, and the Crusaders invaded Constantinople and took all the riches, and suddenly the Catholic Church liked them again. It's a really strange story.
Do you like me now?
Yeah, I got money. Oh yeah, you're cool.
Well, in fact, we do like you now.
Back to the bro culture, aren't we? So yeah. But yeah, it's that's why it works so well, because we see this. We see there are things we recognize. So there's some kind of core in there. We see these core things, and then we see them done in very unusual ways, sort of being used in unusual ways. So it works really well with History of Emotions. And as such, I think History of Emotions is good evidence for her idea, her theory, her construction. They work very well together. So yeah, it's
it accounts for accounts for why different language was used.
Yes.
It accounts for why there are such similarities yet differences over time and at the same time. But it makes you wonder, because Lisa Feldman Barrett, she talks about something called social reality. I mean, she doesn't talk about it, but let me rephrase that. She didn't invent it, but she talks about it. I just don't like the way I said it. This thing called social. She talks about social reality as being equivocated in our brain to physical reality, such that things like race in our culture, right? That's a social reality that to my brain is as real as this pen.
Yeah.
Right. Because of how I interact with it. Social reality is influenced by the language that you use.
Yeah.
So it raises the question, did people feel the same disgust 100 years ago that they do 500 years ago that they do now? Because the language that we use, the emotional regime that we're in, thinks it has the bucket for it is different. And in other cultures, there might be 12 buckets for the same thing.
Exactly.
So it makes you wonder, are they feeling the same thing? In your opinion, I'm asking.
That's a good question. See, the difficulty with History of Emotions is it's very rare we can actually get inside somebody's body and feel what they were feeling. It's the barrier to it. It's
wait till Neuralink. We'll be able to do it.
Go back in time. We need Neuralink and a TARDIS is what we need, and then we can do the two things together. But it's sometimes you'll get some people who do write down, try to describe how they feel. For instance, the people who now live in Africa, in the area now known as Ghana, the 𝐓𝐤𝐻𝐸𝐿, they wrote about how fury was like weeds growing out of their chest. And if you let them grow, then it can take you over. So you have to keep snipping it back. You have to keep control of it.
That's beautiful.
And that kind of gives you a hint to how they felt or feel at that. Lots of writing in the Bible about which of your organs feels what feeling, the most famous being the spleen is anger. We still have that spleen is anger thing, is sort of talked about. But yeah, different parts of honor. The kidneys, I think, are honor. You feel honor in your kidneys. So kind of at the back here, and so you do get rooms, but most of the time you just got to go, well, what do they say about them? How do they talk about them? What did they do when they felt them? So for Abomination, coming back to that one, we can see that what they did is talk about sin. The worst case of Abomination was it's very often associated with the witch crazers, because the witches are seen as an abomination, as abominable. And they are the great sinners. They are adulterers. And not adulterers, probably that too, but... why can I never remember that word? Idolaters. There we go. I'm dyslexic, in case anyone hasn't picked that up yet. Idolaters. A dyslexic writer. You can too.
So is Nick, the producer here, or the host of this channel.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So no barriers. You can write. called a copy editor. They're really helpful. Yeah, mine's amazing. Yeah. So idolatry is, led to, and it had a huge impact on the witch trials. This particular form of abomination thing. And you can't know what that felt like. You can't know what people felt like when they genuinely thought there was a witch and they were terrified of that witch and they felt abomination for that witch. You can only really read what they did, which is quite often horrific, sometimes not. So there's lots of nice stuff out there in history as well, for emotions, happy things and nice things. It's more fun to write about the other stuff, unfortunately. But yeah, so if we could only work out how people felt, but the evidence suggests when you read how ancient Hebrews wrote about things and some others when they do actually try and pin them down, maybe they did feel things a bit differently to us. Maybe.
So let's look into the future then. If we can't quite, we don't have a time machine, but we can set examples for the future, right?
Oh yeah.
So how do you think if 100-year from now version of us are having this conversation and they're looking back at the technology they can find from today about how we felt, what do you think they'd be looking at?
If they were looking at trying to find out how we feel now is different because we never shut up about how we feel and what it feels like. We are in
is that what they're going to make fun of us for?
Possibly. We are in an era now where feelings are everything. Feelings are all that matters. Feelings are the big thing. I actually looked back in the news archive, in Pathé news archives of people interviewing people. And sometime around the 80s, the first question anybody was asked, no matter what, became, how do you feel? Before that, they'd say, oh, you've done the moon landing. So what did you do? What was it like up there? And they'd say, at no point would they go up to Neil Armstrong and go, you came back from the moon. How do you feel? But I guarantee you, I almost feel like putting a bet on this. When Artemis 2 comes back and those astronauts get out and go to the press conference, the first question will be, how do you feel about your achievement? I always put money on it because that's how we are now. And they'll all, I feel brilliant. It was amazing. What did it feel like to set foot on the moon will be the second question. And they'll be, because we're a very feely bunch now. And we like to express and talk about it a lot. So people in 100 years will be just have such information about feelings now that they'll be able to, it'll be easy. So I wish I was in 100 years time, it'd be much easier.
So let's take that, having talked about the past, having talked about the future, having talked about your writing. What is your next book going to be about?
The future.
Oh, imagine that.
Imagine that.
So
it's in early stages yet. We are waiting till the new year because all the publishers are Christmasing, and then I'll start hopefully getting it out there. But I'm hoping the next book will be about the future. So I've been looking into where things are going, and some of it's quite scary, some of it's not so scary, some of it's just interesting, some of it's very scary indeed. So it's that's what I'm hoping.
That's a bit of a tease. What parts are scary? You said scary a few times. What parts are scary about the future of emotions?
A few scary things. The one is there are some of us out there. Lisa's one of them. I'm another. Trying to grab people who develop AI and are trying to do effective computing, which is giving artificial intelligence emotions. And they're trying to say, will you stop saying there are 6 basic emotions to your machines? Which sounds like a little thing, but for example, there have been cameras developed that read your face and work out what emotion you've got.
Bullshit.
Yeah. And they're being used today in parts of the world, China, where if you do not conform to the behavior of emotions that you are supposed to, you may be retrained. And what that means is people start to behave in that way. So the 6 basic emotions that aren't real become real because people have to express a certain way in order. And there's the new emotional regime.
Ooh.
From these cameras. Yeah,
that sounds like a recipe for psychosis, right? Let's not forget Pavlov's dogs. Like Pavlov induced psychosis in dogs by training them to be conditioned to pitches that were too close together.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not going to get fed if it's 100 hertz, but just arbitrary, but you will get fed if it's 105 hertz.
Yeah.
Dogs can't tell the fucking difference, and they just ended up getting psychotic. To me, that's what that sounds like. Oh, you want it to be something? No, you're going to fit in these goddamn 6 buckets, and there's never going to be a consequence. Yeah. Come on.
We see the early days now. If you go on YouTube, and I'm really tempted because I've not done much YouTubing recently, and I'm thinking of coming back because what I've seen is a huge glut of channels that claim to be lie detectors, and they'll watch Prince Harry do an interview and they'll look at his face and say he's this and he's that, and I just want to sit there and go explain why they're talking out of their backsides and what's going on, because it's just so infuriates me that these people, some of them have got 5 million followers on YouTube, but they're just charlatans. They're snake oil salesmen,
But we're in the age of the grift. Come on now.
And they sell them, and the CIA and the FBI listen to these people and get trained by them to spot liars. And if they think they can spot you lying, guess what? It happens again. People start to behave how these people want you to, so they don't get into trouble. So
do you think that's a problem in doing the amount of research that should be done on it? Because the more research that's done, I mean, now people have access in ways that they never did before. Yeah. That instead of the research reflecting what's happening is going to reflect the research.
Seems to be the way things might be going now. I'm hoping that AI are going to get more sophisticated. But of course, the reason they like a set of emotions is it's easy to code. If you make these things fluffy,
6 is easier than 14.
Yeah,
any day.
Which is even easier than kind of an infinite number that depends on your culture and where you are and what you're doing. You need a supercomputer to track one person at one instance in that case. So that's way off. So that's one of the scary things. The other scary thing is there's an emotion I get really interested in. There's a new emotion called solastalgia. And this is a feeling that is described by a lot of people who have already been at the wrong end of climate change. Right, and what it is it's a combination of
that can go both ways, right? If you're in cold, it's getting warmer. If you're in warm, it's getting colder. Yeah. If you're in dry, it's getting wetter. It's
a combination of anger, guilt, and a longing for the home that's not there anymore. It's this is the main what they described: a fury, a guilt, and this sort of I wish I could go home, but I don't have a home. It's underwater, or it's been destroyed, or whatever. And that is going to, I think, be a very important. Lots of areas will have background emotions, sort of moods that set the period. The early modern period in Europe was set by fear because everyone was a bit terrified. They thought the end of the world was coming because they found America, and Aristotle and the Bible didn't mention it. So it was like, hang on, what? Wait, what? And there were lots of diseases. Yeah, lots of diseases, lots of famines, all sorts of things happening. So people were kind of frightened. So that era is kind of a fear background. I think the future is going to have a solastalgia background. A lot of people who are feeling guilty and angry and kind of lost. If we don't do anything about climate change, and it doesn't look like we're doing a particularly brilliant job right now, does it? So, because I know this house I'm in here is predicted to be underwater by 2045 unless they build a massive barrier across the North Sea. So it's going to happen to more people than just people on the Marshall Islands.
All right. And on that cheery note, Rich, I really appreciate you stopping by. I do want to go over a couple questions. I said that we'd go 90 minutes. Do you have 10 minutes to just answer some questions from the chat?
As long as you like. I'd
appreciate that. So, and just as a reminder, Richard Firth Godbehere, also known as Richard Firth Viking Ale Lord, has a book, A Human History of Emotions. Please buy it. Please buy the Audible version because he is the one who does the voice acting for it. So this lovely mellifluous voice you're hearing right now can be yours if you get the Audible. If you do that, please make sure that you give the good ratings on whatever platform you purchase it on. All of that said, let's get to some questions. The first and most important one is love a battlefield? No, I'm kidding. You don't have to answer that.
We are young.
Oh, you suck. That was fantastic.
There are lots of confused people out there now, I'm telling you.
That is great. I'm not even going to mention it. So we were listening to your book in the car on the ride to my parents' place for the American Thanksgiving holiday. And you were talking about evolution. And you were talking about the very chapter that the shell shock chapter.
Yeah.
And evolution, and you were saying how, like, oh, well, the way that patriarchy was at the time, it made sense because men were the most evolved, right? And then you offhandedly say, I think the opposite is true. And my wife cheered. And then afterwards, I was like, oh, well, I'm going to be talking to him a little later. I was like, if you want to have any questions, he's like, yeah, why are women more evolved? So from my wife to you, why do you think it is the case? Why do you think it's laughable that men think they're more evolved? Or why do you think that women are more evolved? Well, even if it's just even though it was a throwaway comment, it doesn't have to be a serious answer.
Well, just look at what we men and the way we moan about things when we don't really have anything to particularly moan about. Look at these people making documentaries about, oh, isn't it terrible masculinity is going away? Oh, isn't it awful masculinity is going away? It's like, no. Yeah, but have you ever had a period or given birth to a child? Until you've done that, for lack of a better phrase, man up, It's just...
Oh, my God.
They do that, and they kick our asses still. While holding the child, they do our jobs better than us. So come on.
All right, I'll buy that for $1. The next question I have is from a friend, Dr. Misha, who is on my server. Had a question about Where'd you go? Have any of your sources changed your assumptions about where your research would lead? Has our collection of today's emotions been the same throughout time? Oh, these are very separate. Seeing that not every writer of every period carefully delineated how they were feeling at the time of writing, how do you tease out this information? And we kind of talked about that, but... Yeah.
Okay, 3 questions. What was the first one? The first one was,
have any of your sources changed your assumptions?
My PhD was supposed to be me going and studying disgust in the past, and disgust was disgust. It was always the same, and everyone always felt it the same because Paul Ekman said it was a basic emotion. So everybody had disgust, didn't they? And very quickly, I read things and went, why aren't they using the word disgust? Why didn't the word disgust exist at all until 1601? What's the word they used before? Why doesn't that word fit? Why doesn't what they're talking about fit? And so at that moment, my whole PhD went and turned that way. So it's kind of, that's the main thing. It became more a study of different kinds of disgust rather than this is what disgust was like,
Mm-hmm. All right. So, and there was a lot of questions in there. So we already kind of talked about how to tease out how people were thinking from writing. So, and there are a lot of questions. So I want to get to as many of them as I can here.
Yeah.
One of them is actually from me. What is an oxytocinal reaction?
Oxytocinal reaction. Oxytocin, there are a few...
And in what context does it make sense?
Yeah. There are very few neuropeptides that there are more testes talked about than oxytocin. I would say bollocks. Oh, I have. Oh dear. Then oxytocin. Oxytocin is often described as the love drug. It's the chemical that means we love someone and we feel someone. I've described it as a fuel in a belongingness engine because what it is, it's the belongingness chemical. When we feel a close attachment to someone, we seem to produce more oxytocin. And the more attached we are, the more we do. And we've seen it in dogs and unbelievably in cats as well, that they produce more when they're nearer their owners. If you go away, they've done tests where that people have gone away for hours and they've checked the oxytocin levels in the pet as he went away. And then when they come back, they've checked them again and they rise as their owner comes back because they feel this connection. It's kind of the connection chemical. It's what makes herd animals, really. Which can be love as well, because obviously it goes up. But also, curiously, when they monitor it in disgust, it's repressed. So one of the reasons you feel disgust for things is because you feel there's no oxytocin there. You've got no connection to it, which works in groups and out groups as well.
There we go.
It's a very cynical kind of thing that the out group, you don't have this oxytocin go up at all. It's repressed. So they're them. and us, we have a bit of that feeling. So that's kind of oxytocin. It's not just about love.
Indeed, it's about love for in-group.
Yes,
because
it's about
high
in-group
oxytocin
belongingness.
levels, high oxytocin levels, which could draw in people that are already close to you, can cause you to draw out, to exclude the out group. Like if you're not part of the crew that I'm feeling this with, like who are you? You're a turd in a punch bowl, and even though you're full of oxytocin, you're not for them, and that could easily lead to aggression to the out group.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to get to the people in the side chat. I want to thank everybody who has been contributing in the side chat. A robust little discussion there. I see you, Titan, Pippa, Airs 106. I think I saw Carol the Atheist, Holy Spackle. We got everybody.
Hey.
Sinister, I was going to say purpose, but I meant to say porpoise. Sinister Porpoise wants to bust your chops a little bit about the AI thing, being that she does programming. She wants to bust your chops and say, no, we're trying to get AI to mimic emotions. I think that was in contrast to programming it to have emotions. So wouldn't that be more like a general AI project?
Some are trying to get it to mimic emotions. There are lots of people out there trying to get it to mimic emotions. There are still some in effective computing that think they can make them feel emotions. Now, here's the big question. If you want to get into philosophy today and you actually want a nice long career, the question you have to ask yourself is, when they actually crack AI that can mimic emotions perfectly, how will you know that they're not feeling them?
Ooh.
So there's a gravy train for life for any aspiring philosopher. There we go.
That my brain hurts just like reacting to that.
Yeah. So there are some people who, and a lot of it is trying to get them to mimic emotions, but they're also trying to react to your emotions. So they have to understand them. It's that reacting bit that I'm worried about. That there are some places out there doing some fantastic work trying to make it much more complicated and much bigger an emotional landscape that they draw upon. But like I say, it's all about processing power and simplicity for programming. So it's not there yet. But the mass majority, Google and Amazon and those people like that, tend to have someone like 𝐓𝐬𝐬𝐿 on their payroll advising them, or they have people who do that. And I look at every day in my email box, I get every emotion paper that has been published. And the first 9 of 10 will be using the basic emotions. They'll usually be AI papers, and that's kind of the worry.
That's super
painful. I know it's about mimicking, but and also people like Lisa and myself might argue that you can't mimic them unless you feel them anyway, because that's what the expression is. It's all part of the construction.
That was just a part I was about to talk about, the embodiment component.
Yes.
They're called feelings because we have touch receptors, interoception to appraise what's going on, proprioception. We have all of these ways of navigating our place in space and time. Yes. So a computer that isn't embodied can understand a feeling without feeling it.
Yes.
Right. That's what that's what broke my brain about your previous question about like how do you know they're not feeling it? And it's just like, oh, they don't have fucking bodies. Oh, wait a second. So, I mean, and then a zillion questions opened up.
Yeah.
But that would be my argument against GAI or AI. It's like, unless they get that processing power in maybe a robot or some kind of body, external body, it's not going to come close.
Yeah, I don't think a head in a vat could feel. And also, a lot of your neurochemicals, neuropeptides and things, they're not all in the brain. That's why you feel things in your gut.
Yeah.
You know, some of these things are other parts of your body. So, yeah. Anyway, it's got a long way to go, but it does worry me. And it more worries me in the world of security and cameras and voice recognition and cars that are being developed that can recognize when you're having road rage and will park you up on the side, which means if you're not having road rage, you'll have road rage.
Well, so I want to get back to some more questions. We were talking about art, taste, aesthetics, and disgust. And Titan, whose full name is Titan Uranus, that's his handle, wonders how you would explain the popularity of Dadaism then. I think that you were saying because things that were repulsive weren't considered beautiful, and I think that some of the Dadaist stuff.
That's getting into aesthetic theory. Find an aesthetic philosopher if you really want a good description of this, but it's basically the idea of the sublime, which is another aspect. One of the things that they said is when the taste theorists were talking about this and looking for this disgust thing, it's because they knew that there were things that weren't revolting, they were sublime. And sublime is basically that which is imperfect or unusual or wrong, but still awesome. The most classic being a mountaintop. There is nothing perfect about a mountaintop. It's asymmetrical, it juts all over the place, it's weird, but it takes your breath away. Mm-hmm. And I say Dadaism goes into the sublime camp. It's something you see and a lot of people go, what? Rather than being disgusting, rather than being revolting.
Mm. And that could be based on cultural, right? It could be just something, a wrinkle different in culture that makes you feel that way, but that culture would need to precede it in order, and maybe Dadaism is a reaction against the things that had happened before that caused that specific thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, and sometimes that reaction against will make people go, oh, that's amazing. Like when postmodernism first popped up, it made lots of people go, wow, that's different because, you know, it's so much better than modernism. I'm really sick and tired of seeing Jackson Pollock throw paint at a canvas. This other thing is better. You know, so it's kind of, you know.
One more. So a little pushback from Maya, who is in the chat. We were talking about emotional intelligence, and you had mentioned that it has existed all throughout history. And as your evidence, you mentioned these texts on manners.
Yes.
And her comment was, emotional intelligence is a bit more than manners.
So are those texts on manners. That's the thing. That's what I was trying to say. I'm not talking about manners in the modern sense of manners as be polite. I'm talking, it's very similar to emotional intelligence. It's kind of being aware of your passions and how you should use them in a situation, depending on what that situation is, and how good you are at being aware of your own and other people's passions in that area. So often these books, they talk about manners, but they'll for example, one of the most famous ones by a guy called Thomas Wright, it's called The Passions of the Mind in General, and it's supposedly about how you use your passions to be mannerful and to understand your circumstances, to read them in others, and to be very, very good at being emotionally intelligent, how to be emotionally intelligent effectively. But underlying that is he's an English Catholic in 1601 telling people how to preach.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's this kind of secondary tale to it. He can't say that explicitly because he doesn't like being burned to death. So he says it in this other way, you know. So.
Read between the lines, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to end it there because you've donated way more of your time than I had expected. We went over. It is super late where you are. Nick, get ready the outro while I take care of the housekeeping and the thank yous and stuff. So just as far as housekeeping goes, this is End Time. This is your place where you get news and politics, fantastic interviews with academics like Dr. Richard Firth Godbehere. Tomorrow there is going to be a show going over the recent events in Ukraine with Operator Starsky and Commander McMillan. I would like to thank you, Dr. Firth Godbehere, for being here. I'd like to thank Zazzy, because I think I love Zazzy.
She's great.
Haven't quite met her, but you know, one of these days you'll have to bring her into the webcam world.
Yeah.
If she allows you to pick her up, because she sounds sassy.
She lets me pick her up for a bit, and then she'll look at me and go, no.
And you know to put her down.
Yeah.
You're a smart man. Thank you to everybody in the side chat for keeping this alive. Thank you for Nick for doing the production side of things. It really helped me not have to think about anything. And with that said, good night.